The Wild Bunch didn't just break the rules of westerns, it obliterated them in glorious slow motion. What began as a simple outlaw tale became the bloodiest, most controversial film of 1969. Director Sam Peckinpah clashed daily with the studio, actors lived like outlaws off-camera, and one shootout featured more squibs and fake blood than any film in history. Studios demanded cuts, but Peckinpah refused. From casting headaches and insane stunts to improvised lines and moral complexity, the behind-the-scenes chaos was as legendary as the movie itself. These are 20 weird, shocking facts you didn't know about the Wild Bunch. Sam Peckinpah didn't originally see William Holden as Pike Bishop. His first choice was Lee Marvin, a man whose weathered face told stories of hardship without a single word. Peckinpah wanted someone who looked like they'd lived through the grit and grime of life, someone whose presence demanded respect and fear. Marvin loved the script, calling it one of the best westerns he'd ever read, but he had already committed to Paint Your Wagon, a musical western that promised easier work and a paycheck with less stress. Peckinpah cycled through other actors, Sterling Hayden, Charlton Heston, even unknowns, but the studio insisted on a bankable star. Reluctantly, Peck turned to Holden. At 50, Holden was no longer the golden age Hollywood leading man. He was drinking heavily, grappling with a stalled career, desperate for a comeback. But when he arrived in Mexico, something changed. He didn't present a polished, Hollywood facade. He showed up weathered, tired, carrying the weight of every bad choice he'd ever made. Peckinpah saw a man who understood mortality, the inevitability of decline, and the bitter responsibility of leading men toward certain doom. Holden didn't just perform Pike Bishop, he became him. Every gesture, every glance, carried authenticity. The audience could feel his weariness, his gravitas, his quiet despair. By the time the camera rolled, Holden wasn't merely acting, he was embodying the soul of a doomed outlaw in a violent, collapsing world. The opening Starbucks shootout in The Wild Bunch remains one of cinema's most unforgettable and chaotic sequences. Peckinpah didn't want a choreographed, sanitized gunfight, he wanted chaos. Bullets tearing through bodies, blood spraying everywhere, innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. But achieving that chaos on camera in 1969 was a logistical nightmare. Squibs, the small explosive charges used to simulate bullet hits, were limited by budget constraints. Peckinpah ignored limitations. Over 200 squibs were wired across actors, stunt performers, and extras, a staggering number compared to other films of the time. The team spent 3 days rigging, rehearsing, and testing, ensuring the violence appeared real and unpredictable. When the cameras finally rolled, squibs fired out of sequence, blood splattered across the lens, and the screams of extras were so authentic that crew members believed someone had actually been injured. Shooting took 2 full days and burned through thousands of feet of film. When Peckinpah watched the dailies, he finally smiled. He had captured violence in its rawest form, ugly, random, and unforgettable. Studio executives were horrified, labeling the footage unwatchable, excessive, and career-threatening. But Peck knew he had something transformative. That opening massacre didn't just shock audiences, it redefined action cinema. It forced viewers to confront death and chaos in ways they had never seen before, and it set the tone for a film that would challenge Hollywood conventions, morality, and the audience's tolerance for on-screen violence forever. Ernest Borgnine joined the Wild Bunch expecting a traditional Western, heroes in crisp outfits, clear morality, and tidy deaths. Peckinpah's script obliterated that fantasy. Pike Bishop's gang weren't shining lawmen or romantic outlaws, they were aging criminals clinging to survival, loyalty, and the desperate remnants of their reputations. The violence around them was prolonged, graphic, and almost merciless. Borgnine initially considered leaving, unsettled by the blood-soaked realism, but the depth of Dutch Angstrom pulled him in. Angstrom wasn't just a sidekick, he was a man negotiating his own mortality in a collapsing world, carrying the weight of experience, regret, and enduring camaraderie. Borgnine infused Dutch with humanity, transforming him into a touchstone for the audience amidst the chaos. Every subtle gesture, every weary glance communicated a life spent on the edge, haunted by choices and inevitable consequences. In a narrative drenched in brutality, Borgnine's grounded presence gave viewers someone to care about, someone real. His portrayal proved that even anti-heroes could possess complexity and heart, elevating the ensemble beyond caricature. In Dutch Angstrom, audiences saw the emotional cost of survival, loyalty, and aging in a violent, unrelenting world. Borg 9 reminded everyone that empathy could exist even amidst murder, greed, and chaos. The climactic shootout in the Wild Bunch wasn't just a finale, it was an apocalypse unleashed on celluloid. Peckinpah transformed a dusty Mexican town into a chaotic battlefield, orchestrating a 10-minute sequence that involved over 200 extras, massive squibs, and real explosives. For 5 grueling days, stunt performers were hurled through windows, dragged across dirt and cobblestone, and set upon by relentless gunfire. William Holden fired blank rounds repeatedly until his hands blistered, while cameras captured every twitch, spasm, and splatter in painstaking slow motion. Peckinpah's vision of violence wasn't glamorous, it was agonizing, grotesque, and hypnotically beautiful in its horror. Each death was carefully framed yet shocking in its randomness, emphasizing the futility and brutality of the gang's world. Crew members and actors were bruised, exhausted, and drenched in fake blood, yet the results surpassed expectation. The sequence redefined Western action cinema, expanding its scale, intensity, and emotional resonance. By combining realism with slow-motion artistry, Peck created a blood-soaked meditation on mortality, loyalty, and the inescapable consequences of a life lived outside the law. Audiences were no longer spectators, they were witnesses to the collapse of men, morality, and myth, forever altering the way violence would be depicted on screen. Sam Peckinpah's use of slow motion in The Wild Bunch wasn't a decorative flourish, it was deeply personal. A Marine veteran, he had witnessed the chaos of combat and the fractured way trauma alters perception. Real violence is instantaneous, but memory and fear stretch it, making every instant feel endless. Peck wanted audiences to feel that distortion. By shooting death scenes at 120 frames per second, bullets seemed to hang in the air, bodies arced with impossible grace, and blood suspended mid-flight became almost tangible. The effect was hypnotic, brutal, and unnerving. Critics labeled it pornographic, accusing Peck of reveling in gore, but he defended it as honesty, a way to confront the audience with the raw, unglamorous reality of human mortality. The slow-motion sequences made death both intimate and monumental, giving weight to each choice, each bullet, each fall. For the viewer, violence became a spectacle that was simultaneously beautiful and horrifying, forcing empathy for both victims and perpetrators. This approach didn't just shock, it fundamentally changed action cinema, teaching directors that choreography, pacing, and perception could be as essential as narrative in conveying the stakes of human conflict. Peck's vision turned death into a meditation, slowing time itself to examine the cost of survival in a collapsing world. Richard Boone was originally pegged to play D. Thornton, but studio negotiations derailed the plan. Enter Robert Ryan, who brought an austere gravitas and moral complexity to a character trapped between duty and conscience. Thornton isn't a caricature of vengeance, he is a man caught in a web of impossible choices: enforce the law, hunt former friends, or rot silently in prison. Ryan's restrained performance lent Thornton a quiet dignity, particularly during the final shootout, where he never fires in rage but surveys the unfolding carnage with measured sorrow. Each glance communicates history, regret, and the heavy burden of responsibility. In contrast to the Wild Bunch's nihilism, Thornton becomes a human anchor, a moral compass in a world gone mad. His choices aren't about spectacle, they're about survival, honor, and a last opportunity to assert agency amid chaos. The tension between duty and conscience defines every scene, giving audiences a character whose restraint speaks louder than bullets. Ryan transformed Thornton from a supporting role into the film's most tragic figure, showing that Western heroism could exist not in bravado but in moral deliberation. His portrayal balances the blood-soaked anarchy with a humanity that lingers long after the screen goes dark. Filming The Wild Bunch in Mexico was a high-stakes gamble. Local authorities and residents worried that the film's raw depiction of corruption, violence, and lawlessness would reinforce negative stereotypes. Peckinpah refused to water down his vision, insisting on filming on location and hiring local crew, ensuring that even supporting characters felt authentic and culturally grounded. Off-camera, the production mirrored the anarchy on screen. Actors lived like outlaws, indulging in heavy drinking, gambling, and even firing guns into the night, testing boundaries and tolerance. William Holden struggled to maintain sobriety while embodying the weary leadership of Pike Bishop. Warren Oates became notorious for drunken escapades that sometimes spilled into improvised performances. Peckinpah watched, rarely intervening, believing that real-life chaos fed authenticity, allowing raw emotions and unpredictability to bleed into the narrative. The result was a cast physically and emotionally drained, yet electrifying on screen. Exhaustion, tension, and recklessness became tools rather than obstacles, lending performances a realism impossible to fabricate in a controlled studio. This blending of life and art captured the desperation, loyalty, and brutality that defined the story, leaving audiences with characters that felt lived in, flawed, and unforgettable. Peck's willingness to embrace disorder created a cinematic experience as chaotic as the world it depicted. The stunts in The Wild Bunch were as dangerous as the violence on screen. The infamous bridge explosion exemplifies the risks, wind-shifted burning debris toward stunt performers and cameras, making the sequence a genuine life-or-death challenge. Bo Hopkins, wired with squibs to simulate gunshot hits, genuinely feared for his safety, a fear captured on film. The bridge itself was destroyed in the take, leaving no room for retakes. Peckinpah's obsession with authenticity meant these near-death experiences were standard, not anomalies. Every stunt was designed to test limits, blending physical danger with narrative impact. Improvised moments added to the unpredictability. Warren Oates' drunken monologue about loyalty emerged organically, yet it became one of the emotional anchors of the scene, grounding chaos with human sentiment. Crew members and actors endured extreme physical strain, burns, and bruises, yet these hardships translated into on-screen intensity impossible to fabricate. Peckinpah's meticulous planning intersected with improvisation, creating a tension-filled environment where every frame carried both risk and artistry. The stunts were not merely spectacle, they reinforced the perilous world of aging outlaws clinging to survival. In blending danger with performance, Peckinpah achieved a cinematic realism that continues to influence action choreography and stunt work decades later. When The Wild Bunch reached the MPAA, it almost faced an X rating, a death sentence for commercial distribution. The board balked at Peckinpah's signature slow-motion killings, the staggering number of squibs, and the unapologetic bloodshed. Studios feared a financial disaster, demanding cuts that could sanitize the film into a conventional Western. Peckinpah refused to compromise, he believed the brutality was essential to the story's moral weight. William Holden leveraged his star power to advocate for the director, arguing that realism, not censorship, was necessary. The MPAA ultimately granted an R rating, requiring only minimal trims, but the controversy had already ignited public debate. Critics were polarized, some condemned the graphic violence, others hailed it as a revolutionary depiction of chaos and human frailty. Audiences, misled by traditional marketing, often reacted with shock and walkouts, fueling outrage and fascination in equal measure. Counterculture viewers embraced the film, craving its unflinching portrayal of flawed anti-heroes and moral ambiguity. The battle over ratings and content cemented The Wild Bunch as a cinematic lightning rod, forcing Hollywood to reckon with violence as a narrative and aesthetic device. In doing so, Peckinpah challenged not just the boundaries of taste but the entire moral compass of the Western genre. The final shot of The Wild Bunch remains iconic, Thornton riding away with the surviving villagers, a rare glimmer of humanity in a sea of carnage. Robert Ryan pushed for this ending, believing the audience deserved a moment of redemption amid unrelenting tragedy. Peckinpah initially resisted, fearing that hope might undermine the film's nihilism, but ultimately conceded, crafting a bittersweet conclusion that softened the brutal descent without undermining its impact. After release, Peckinpah's reputation in Hollywood suffered, studios saw him as ungovernable. Yet the film thrived in midnight screenings, revival houses, and eventually cult status, proving the power of uncompromising vision. Directors such as Scorsese, Coppola, and Tarantino have cited The Wild Bunch as a seminal influence, borrowing its slow-motion violence, morally complex antiheroes, and sprawling nihilistic narrative. The film redefined the Western, but more than that, it reshaped action storytelling entirely. Intensity, realism, and emotional complexity were no longer optional. Its legacy persists, not only in homage and technique but in its daring portrayal of humanity's contradictions. Peckinpah didn't merely push cinematic boundaries, he rewrote them, leaving a lasting imprint on global cinema and inspiring generations to confront both violence and morality with unflinching honesty.